Forward. Hello, Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to Tasha's Tales. Today's guest is James. Hi, James.
Hi, how are you?
Good, thank you. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah. So my name's James. I'm a married dad of three beautiful children and an even more beautiful wife. And I am 39 and 40 this year. And
Oh,
a, I suppose the reason I'm on the podcast is that my unfortunate backstory is that I was diagnosed with motor neuron disease 3 years ago this month, actually. So, yeah, and at the moment, I'm just trying to raise awareness for the condition itself.
yeah, and I found you on Instagram because my husband's colleague, who is also our age, late mid to late 30s, and
Yeah,
she was diagnosed with MND in December. I'll be honest, James, prior to, her diagnosis, it's not something I had heard of or I was aware of. So obviously my husband told me a bit about it and he's raising money. He's doing 200 miles this weekend to raise money for MND. And I just wanted
amazing.
to use the opportunity to discuss it, share kind of what is MND. So let's start with that first of all. What is MND?
I don't know the sort of scientific description of it, but it is a neurological disorder that is primarily, it starts sporadically. So there's 98% of people roughly that have motor neuron disease, and I am one of those. And the other 2% are a sort of what they call familial. So they would have a sort of a gene mutation that has motor neuron disease in it, I think is what the right way of saying it. And they will then get passed down generation to generation. Um, and it basically affects sort of a signal in your brain that will tell your nerves to transmit the right signals to your muscles. And over time, those signals stop working, which will then in turn make the muscles stop working, which will create muscle weakness and all the other wonderful things that go with motor neuron disease. But that's a bit of sarcasm for you. That's how it gets me through the day.
Yeah, no, you need a little bit of humor to kind of get by, don't you? And like you said, you got diagnosed nearly 3 years ago this year. What was kind of the symptoms and the signs that led you to think something's not quite right here?
So I remember the night vividly, and I come home from a run one night. I used to run quite religiously, and there's sort of a theory behind it, which we can probably discuss later. But I come home from a run one night and I showed my wife my left bicep, my sort of around the bicep and tricep area, and it was just continuously twitching like an eye twitch when you're tired.
Yeah.
And it was uncontrollable, couldn't stop it. Whatever I did, it would just carry on. And that's when it all started, really. And I went on with life as normal. I carried on running. I was training for a half marathon, ironically, raising money for the Motor Neuron Disease Association as well. And I was doing that because my nan, unfortunately, passed away with motor neuron disease. And it didn't really cross my mind that that's what I potentially could have had because we were on the understanding that my nan didn't have a genetic mutation that could be passed
Mm.
down. So I carried on with life as normal. And over time, I realized and noticed that I was starting to get like a heavy feeling in that arm that was twitching. So nothing has affected my right arm up to that point, and my left arm just started feeling just heavy. So I was doing things. I used to look really weird. I used to walk around the house. I can't do it now because I've got even weaker. But I'd put my hands out in front of me, and I would do like circles with them, and I'd show my wife and go, "Look at my left arm. I can do like infinite amount of sort of circles with my right arm from the shoulder, and my left arm would after about 5 or 6 attempts just drop, and I didn't have any strength in it at all. So we then decided to see the doctor and start the process of seeing what the issue was. And 2 years later, and COVID and lockdowns, I then got diagnosed over that time. So
Took 2 years for you to get a diagnosis.
Yeah, yeah. I think it would have been a little bit quicker if there wasn't a lockdown, because my first consultation with a neurologist was after I had a test from my local GP, which tested you for, I forget the name, but it sounds a bit like creatinine or creatine. It's not creatine, that's a supplement, but it sounds a bit
Okay.
like that. And if you've got high levels of that in your bloodstream, it means that there's muscle breaking down, which predominantly are proteins, and then you'll have a high protein count in your bloodstream. And the doctor was like, I don't think there's anything to worry about. It's probably from your running where you're burning muscle and fat. And but I think what might be worth doing is referring you to a neurologist, and this was just a general neurologist, just to get a second opinion. And this was before lockdown happened, and before even COVID was even a thing. Went through just a physical examination, went through my family history, explained about my nan, and he referred me to get a couple of tests. One of those was an MRI scan that come back fine. And the other one was something called an EMG test, which is basically like an I can't really explain it, but they basically stick lots of little electric pads all over your arms and your body, and they see how it affects your it sort of sees what signal you're giving back to the machine when they
Okay.
pass an electric current through it. So you use like an electric shock. And then the other one is where they stick a little needle with a microphone on the end of it, probably about an inch big, and they'll just stick the tip just in the sort of muscle, and then again measure whatever they're measuring to see if there's a malfunction of signal of some sort in the muscle. And the results come back inconclusive. There was nothing that they would look at to say, yep, it's definitely this, or it's because it's hard to diagnose motor neuron disease because they have to eliminate everything else other than the disease itself because there's no clear cut test to say
I
you've
was,
got
I was,
MND.
yeah, I was about to ask, is there like one specific test or is there just a range of different things and they have to come with some sort of diagnosis?
Exactly. They go through everything else, rule out everything else to sort of funnel it to the worst case scenario, which is in my case motor neuron disease. So I had the tests, and I then had a consultation to tell me the results of these tests. And this was the day before the world lockdown. And he said, it's inconclusive, don't quite know what you've got. Let's give it 3 months and we'll come back and see what's going on. And then lockdown happened for I can't even remember how long it was
Yeah.
now. What was it, six
Well,
months,
yeah, it
eight
just
months?
went on. Yeah, yeah.
So I just carried on with life, enjoyed lockdown, and I then went back to work and noticed that my right arm had started twitching the same as my left arm, exactly the same place, exactly the same symptoms. So it prompted me to call the doctor and say, look, haven't heard from you. It's been 6 to 8 months. You said to, touch base in three. Um, Something else has happened. So they booked me in for another EMG test, which was even more invasive. And the needles were put literally everywhere in my tongue, under my chin, in my back.
In your
And
tongue?
yeah, yeah, it was horrific. I would not want
Sounds
an EMG test ever
awful.
again. And I then had to wait for those results, which I think took about a month. And when the results come back, they had come back with, certain data to show that the neurologist would say the words that I never wanted to hear. And he invited me back in for a consultation. Got the letter through to say he'd like to see you on this date, and it was Christmas Eve, 2020.
Oh,
And
James.
I said to my wife, I'm not going to that consultation. So I rescheduled it for the January and then went in. We were still in restrictive mode from the lockdown. So I had to go into hospital on my own with a mask on. Couldn't bring anyone with me. And he sat down and basically said, look, we don't beat around the bush. I'll tell you straight, I think you've got motor neuron disease. And I was like, I just didn't know what to think. And
Gosh, James, that sounds so,
yeah,
so
so
hard.
yeah, so that's where I was. And then, but it didn't end there. It was, that's why, this is why it then took 2 years, because up until that point, I think that then took, up to that point was probably a year.
Mm.
No, it wasn't. That was about 18 months up to that point. So from when I saw my first GP to then the referral to the neurologist, we then had lockdown. To get to that point in January to have this motor neuron disease hanging over me with not an official diagnosis took a good 18 months. It then took me from January to June 2021, so another sort of 6 months. And I then saw two more neurologists. I then saw the neurologist that now looks after me in my local hospital. He then looked at all the data from the general neurologist and basically gave me a physical examination, didn't offer any more tests, and said, yeah, unfortunately, I think he's right. I would agree with what he said. I don't think it's anything else because I went in with like A4 bits of paper that I had printed off from Googling everything other than MND and trying to look for a mimicking, disease and things like that to hope it's something else. And he then said, yeah, I think he's right. Gave me a physical examination, could see that I'd lost sort of muscle mass sort of around my shoulder, sort of it atrophied around the back of the shoulder. And then said, look, I'm not going to officially diagnose you yet. I was like, okay. I'm going to refer you to the professor of neurology in Oxford University. Excuse me. And he then said, yeah, go to Oxford University Hospital, which was about a 2 hour drive up from where I live in Bournemouth,
Yeah.
and went to go and see him. I was in and out in about an hour, and he gave me the official diagnosis, and then that was the start of it. So that was the 14th of June, 2021, and that is a day that I will remember forever.
Yeah, of course. And I think, so you know how you said that your grandma had
Yeah,
motor neuron disease? So is that something that you had the back of your mind when you noticed your arms? Is that something that was that like your fear deep
it
down?
did cross my mind. Yeah, it did cross my mind, and I always sort of thought, even when my nan had it, which she died a long, long time ago. I want over 10 years ago. And at that point, I was thinking, God, maybe I need to go down the gym and start building some muscle because I don't need to have, I want to be, muscular before I even get it if it's genetic.
Yeah.
But then it sort of we just carried on with life. I got married, had children, and bought a house, things like that. And it just sort of slipped my mind. And then when I started getting the symptoms, yeah, I thought, do you think I've had it genetically? And I don't know if the percentages, but I think it's quite rare to then it skip a generation. I
Mm.
think it's more common for then my nan's children, i.e., my mother and her sisters, to potentially get MND. So I'd sort of think, well, it might not have been genetic because in my mind, if it was, I then had a chance that I would then pass it on to my children.
Yeah.
So when I was diagnosed officially in Oxford, they offered me like a blood test that tested for all 40 at that time, all 40 known genetic mutations of MND. So I had like I think it was about 5 or 6 like tubes of blood taken, whatever they're called, the
Yeah.
vials.
Yeah.
And that then got sent off. And about 6 months later, I got the results that come back. No, it's not, because none of the blood tests has come up as a genetic mutation, which was good in one way because I was less likely to pass anything down to my children. But it was bad in another way because it's harder to treat, harder to find a cure because they're focusing the treatment around MND at the moment is they're focusing more on the genetic mutation side because they've got something to go on.
Right.
And
Okay.
so, yeah, it was sort of a blessing but a curse at the same time.
Yeah,
So,
knowing that, there's a chance you won't pass it on to kind of the children, it won't be passed
yeah,
on.
yeah.
Gosh, it just sounds like such a difficult journey for you, for your family, for your loved ones, you know. In
Yeah, it
terms,
hasn't been easy, but we've adapted quite well. The kids, they still young enough to not really understand it too much. They just think that I've got bad arms at the moment. And I do count myself very, very, I don't want to say lucky because no, what I wouldn't wish this condition upon anyone, but I do count myself extremely lucky compared to others that have been diagnosed after me and are already wheelchair bound and they're already having to be, peg fed. They're using a peg to be fed, and the type of MND that I have, which was ALS, is the most common one that most people have. It is a very slow, progressive version in comparison to others. I think most people die within about anywhere between 18 months and 5 years.
I was not aware of those
Yeah,
statistics.
yeah. So it's quite a horrific condition.
Mm.
So I do count myself lucky and fortunate that I'm able to carry on with a life, although it's progressively getting harder to do things with the muscle weakness and the symptoms with MND because it's not just the muscle weakness. You don't just sort of think, oh well, I can't lift that cup up now. It's everything else. Everything else takes a lot longer. Everything else is more tiresome. Just putting on a jacket or a coat just takes a huge amount of effort. So it's everything's a slower pace now.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
so
How old are your children?
so I've got Harry, who's my eldest. He's 8, and I've got George, who's just turned 6, and I've got my little Rosie, who is turning 3 next month. And
Oh,
she was our little lockdown surprise.
oh, those are such
So
beautiful names. I love
oh,
their names. They're
thank
really,
you,
really
yeah.
nice. And
So
being a mum of two myself, kids are hard work. It's
oh,
physically, mentally exhausting as it is.
it is, and I applaud any parent that stays home and is the stay-at-home parent predominantly,
Yeah,
because since having to leave my job because of the condition, I've become that person where I'm predominantly at home and I see the kids off to school and I see them when they come home and I'm, here on inset days and things like that and when they're homesick and it is hard work.
it is hard
Having
work.
lived, having worked full time and sometimes gone to work and gone, oh, I don't want to go to work, I want to stay at home. Yeah, it's a lot easier to go to work.
Yeah, yeah, right.
Yeah,
I'll
I love
share
them to
this clip
bits.
with my husband.
Yeah, that's good. So
Um,
yeah,
yeah. So obviously explaining to Rosie and George and Harry, have you thought about how how you would
yeah.
explain it to them and
I mean, Rosie's still way
far
too
too
young
young.
to understand. She's heard the comments, oh, can't Daddy can't do that. He's got bad arms, and doing the whole, what dads do and what I did when my first was born, and you do the whole dad thing and throw them up in the air and catch them and things like that. I've not been able to do that with Rosie, which has been quite difficult. But the two, Rosie and George, I don't think they're old enough. Harry knows the a bit more detail, and I show him by explaining how the condition affects me and why Daddy has bad arms by sort of playing with him. So like we'll do like we'll go and do an arm wrestle, for example, and show him that he can actually now beat me in an arm wrestle because that's how the condition affects your muscles. And even he's like, well, can't you not just do some weightlifting or something like that? And I'm like, I wish I could, but I can't. And
Yeah.
we're slowly sort of introducing the the results of motor neuron disease. And again, I go back to the slow progressive nature of mine and how I feel quite fortunate that they haven't had to see what a lot of people do see with motor neuron disease with is a quick progressive deterioration. They could be walking 1 month and 3 months later they could be in a wheelchair. So it's been quite nice to be able to slowly transition them into knowing what I will be going through, or we all are going through, and what MND is. But yeah, at the moment, the two younger children, George and Rosie, will they'll know as time goes on,
Yeah.
and they'll pick up things. But yeah, Harry knows the most, and I will try and
Yeah.
do that as light-hearted as possible.
Yeah,
The
of
Motor Neuron
course.
Disease Association do offer sort of information and different ways of telling children at a certain age. And I think even my 8-year-old is still too young to even sort of benefit from those sorts of things. So yeah, they're amazing. So they'll
Yeah.
adapt to it, I'm sure.
In terms of support and treatment, then, what do people have, who've been diagnosed with motor neuron disease? What kind of support and treatments out there for people?
So I'll touch on support first. So support for me, and again, this is different for everybody because I've learned over the last sort of 3 years that it is vastly different depending on where you live in the country, and that is so unfair because one part of England or Wales or Scotland could have less treatment or more treatment than others. And I count myself lucky again that touch wood at the moment, I can't fault the sort of support and care that I have been offered and received since my diagnosis. I've sort of been left to my own devices at the moment because of the speed of progression. And I've got, my an email address to my occupational therapist that I can sort of directly contact them and her team, and they will respond within sort of 24, 48 hours. I have sort of quarterly, maybe even longer, quarterly visits from them. They come round and sort of check where I am in my progression, what they can implement to help with things. And they've not offered, they've provided me with things like special cutlery that I can grip easier and you can bend into different places. And even like a little tray thing that goes around the edge of a plate. So I can sort of, because I can't use my left hand or arm anymore, you can sort of like spoon the food to the lip so you can sort of scoop it up.
Yeah.
And they are on the case. I think I'm quite sort of ahead of the game in terms of how my progression is because it's slow enough that I can potentially manage what's about to come. And I think I'm a few steps ahead. And then when the occupational therapists come over, they're like 10 more steps ahead of me. So I do
Right.
find the support is very good in that respect. And the support from the whole MND community, it is unbelievably supportive. And I've never made so many acquaintances and I want to say friends as well since I've been diagnosed. And that is so apparent when I was diagnosed. I set up a Facebook page, sorry, a Facebook group called MND and Beyond. And it's for anyone that is living or dealing with MND themselves from the UK to America to Canada. I've got even people from Australia on the group, one of which is a moderator. And I've made sort of really good friends from just that group and got a lot of information from it as well. Because sometimes when you are going through a terminal illness like motor neuron disease, it's hard not to look at the people, for example, like unfortunately Rob Burrows, who
Yes,
passed away
yeah.
recently. It's hard not to look at someone like that and base your experience on looking at someone else going through something a lot quicker and a lot more aggressive because I don't come across many people that have got a slow version like myself. So it's hard to know what is ahead, what's the next step for me, although I know what the next step is probably going to be. So when I had conversations with people and made friends with people within the community that have got a very similar progressive nature of motor neuron disease like myself, it's almost like free therapy because you can sort of discuss, oh, have you had this yet? Have you had this yet? Or have your fingers curled up yet? And we sort of talk quite openly about how the progression is because it sort of almost helps you in a way to know
Gosh,
that
that
not,
is so important to not feel alone, not to feel
yeah,
isolated, to feel like you can talk and it's nothing's too much, nothing's TMI, that you've got you're able to kind of have a safe space to be able to share thoughts
exactly.
and experiences.
Yeah, no, definitely, definitely. So yeah, the support I think I've I've got an abundance of it. And that's not from the medical field, it's from people that are living and dealing with the condition. There's a really nice lady on the group as well that unfortunately lost her husband recently, and she manages like a chat within the Facebook group that is made for carers. So anyone that's caring for someone. And out of the sort of 1,200 members that we've got in the group now, I think at least 300 of them are carers in this chat, and they just sort of have conversations or vent or things like that. So yeah, I think there's an abundance of support if you know where to look for it.
Yeah, I was
I do
about to
come
say, it
across it.
sounds like you've kind of done your bit, like you've been really motivated to
Yeah,
source the support and also create support as well.
yeah. I think you can get. I've come across lots of people commenting about support where they don't feel they've got enough, they don't get any, and I sometimes have to sort of hold back and say, well, I want to say, have you even asked for it?
Hmm.
So it's one of those situations. If you don't ask, you don't get. Don't expect it to be there. So yeah, I mean that's the support really, and the treatment side of things. That's probably another podcast all on its own. But the only drug that is available and prescribed to people with motor neuron disease is a drug called Riluzole that's been out for, I think, as long as motor neurons has been out for, about 30 years, 28 years, something like that. And that's the frustrating part of the condition because there's not been any progress with medicine since Riluzole. And I was prescribed Riluzole when I was diagnosed. I took it for about 9 to 12 months and had some quite bad effects from it. So my neurologist was like, look, you know, it's not really going to make much of give you much of an effect in terms of longevity life wise, because apparently some people disagree with this. From what I've heard, it's anywhere between 3 to 6 months extended life that it gives you,
The
which is important.
medication.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, it slows it down, and to the point where it can, on average, give you somewhere between 3 to 6 months of additional life, which on the grand scheme of things isn't a lot, but it is for some. And what I was experiencing from things like additional muscle weakness, my the twitching that you get within the from the disease called fasciculations, they were increasing, and I felt tired. I felt just awful on it. So that he agreed that I would come off that drug. So, and there's nothing really else out there at the moment.
No, so there's no medication.
No, no.
I
There's
didn't expect that at
I
all.
I was in the Houses of Parliament a month or two ago, and I was invited to go and do a talk about my story, and we touched on treatments. There's one treatment for the one of the genetic mutations for motor neuron disease, which they call SOD1, and it's just a type of motor neuron disease that they've categorized as that name. And they've actually created a drug to help slow that particular mutation down. They've got funding for it, I believe, and before it goes to the NHS for it to be prescribed, it has to go through something called NICE, which
Okay.
is like a board of people that will say whether it's too expensive or not, I guess. And it didn't get approved. So you can get this drug now in Europe, America, I think Canada, I think Australia, but you can't get it in
Not
the
the
UK.
UK.
No, because I assume is because it doesn't really affect enough people for them to warrant actually
London it.
funding it. Because when you break it down, the figures are they say there's about 6,000 people a year that have motor neuron disease in 1 year, and the same amount of people unfortunately pass away from it. So if you take 2% of that population, you're talking maybe 60 to 100 people with that specific gene mutation.
Yeah.
And when you've got a drug that they've created, which I think I haven't got this as sort of actual information, but I've been told it can cost around £350,000 per year per person for the drug. So when you do the numbers for 100 people, yes, it's 100 people they're going to save, and everyone's absolutely livid with them not allowing this
Yeah.
drug to be given to people. that's the hurdles we need to jump over and
Yeah.
raise even more awareness, which is what
Uh-huh.
I do, what I'm trying to do, and what you're doing to try and get, the treatment we need.
Yeah. Gosh, it's just a whole different world, whole different perspective, but I'm totally honored that you've given me the time to talk about it because I feel like you've opened my eyes in terms of
Oh,
no, you
thank
have
you.
because obviously we hear about Rob Burrows, and I don't know if you remember, but a few years ago, maybe even a decade ago, there was a huge kind of discussion around ALS when people were doing the bucket challenges. Do you remember?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But again, that's the surface level information that people have, and then they move on, and then
Mm,
it's the next story. But I feel like talking to you's really kind of touched a nerve within where I'm thinking, gosh, there's so much more to it, and so much more that we as a community, as a society, could be doing together.
definitely. Yeah.
Um, I'm really intrigued to know about the link that you wanted to share at the beginning of the podcast about running. And
Okay.
yeah, I mean, we've
This
got
is
four
only
minutes,
I
James.
know, yeah. So
So
if it runs over, you'll have to give me a call back and we'll
yeah,
carry on. So
absolutely.
it will just cut off. So if I do go off, just rein me in a little bit.
Yeah.
So my theory of because no one knows why motor neuron disease, ALS, starts and how you get it. And it I slowly sort of started to look at who was getting motor neuron disease and who was being publicized that have got it. And they were rugby players, football players. In Australia, they were Australian rules football players. There was some people in America that were, I think, American football players, even a baseball player. And I was thinking, what do they do? What are they all doing that are causing this motor
Common
neuron disease?
factor.
They're all playing a physical sport. I was running. That was exercise. I was pushing my body to the limits. I was running and adding extra stress. They were all playing on grass, which potentially would have been sprayed with some sort of pesticide to keep the weeds off, things like that. And in rugby terms, they were all having sort of head injuries. There's no scientific fact for this because I did bring this up in Parliament, and they said no, there's no link to exercise and things like that. But there is a common factor around it. And my theory is that potentially I would have always had motor neuron disease at some point in my life. A bit like a cancer, it's potentially laying dormant,
Hmm.
and everyone else is in the same category in my theory, and we've just triggered it early. And that was triggered by, I think, in my case, a couple of factors: the running, which was adding extra stress to my body, the environment where I was breathing in potentially fumes from the car, exhausts, things like that. And like the sports people of our time that have had the condition, I was running across fields, farmland, things like that, that potentially would have had pesticides sprayed on them that I was inhaling. So there's my link to where I
Well,
think motor neuron
it's
disease
worth
has
saying it
started
out
with
loud and
myself.
share. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to confuse the fact that I don't think this is causing it.
Yeah.
I think it has triggered it early.
Yeah, yeah. And that's just your own ex lived experiences,
Yeah,
and knowledge, isn't it? So
mm,
you have an Instagram page,
I do.
Diagnosed Dad.
I do. Yeah,
So guys, whoever's listening to this, follow James, support James, and there's also a GoFundMe page,
there is. Yeah.
which I will be sharing.
Oh, bless you. Thank you so
No,
much.
absolutely.
Everything's,
I will
yeah.
be harassing people on WhatsApp, don't you worry.
Thank you very much. Everything
Um,
helps.
yeah, it does. And for me, like I said to you, it's about us coming together. It's about, sharing the awareness. And obviously, I'm really proud of my husband as well, for doing the 200 miles this weekend, again, showing
Amazing.
solidarity to, for this colleague of his. And yeah, I feel like I really hope our conversation touches kind of people and allows them to hear your story and be able to help and have those discussions in workplaces, at universities, at cafes, because I think we need to. I think we need to recognize.
Yeah,
So thank you. I really, really appreciate your
that's
time.
all right. Thank you so much for having me.
Happy Father's Day for yesterday. I hope you had a really good
Thank
day.
you.
Um,
Yes, it was lovely. Yeah, weather was nice.
yeah, yeah, no, but honestly, absolute pleasure. Thank you so, so much.
That's all right. I
Yeah,
look forward to hearing the episode and good
yeah,
luck with the rest of
yeah.
them.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And like I said, I'll be supporting you and I'll be sharing all your pages. So,
Thank you so much.
all
Brilliant.
right. Thanks, James. Take care.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.